In 1932, a man named Earl Wheeler walked out of a bank in Cincinnati with nothing but the shirt on his back and the shoes on his feet. He had just lost his entire savings, 14 years of working 12-hour shifts at a steel plant, gone in a single afternoon. He was 51 years old. He had no family left. And he was about to join the 3 million Americans who were already living on the streets, sleeping under bridges, riding freight trains, and doing whatever it took to survive the worst economic catastrophe in modern history. What Earl didn't know yet, what none of those men knew, was that over the next few years, they would develop a system of survival so sophisticated, so quietly brilliant, that parts of it are still being used by preppers, campers, and disaster relief experts today. 25 survival tricks, some of them ingenious, some of them almost shocking by modern standards, and at least 3 of them that were officially banned by city governments across the United States because they worked too well. I'm going to walk you through all 25 of them today. And if you stay until number 1, I promise you, it will change how you think about resourcefulness forever. Before we dive in, if this kind of forgotten history is what you live for, hit subscribe right now. We uncover stuff like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Number 25 is where we start, and it's something so simple, you'll wonder why nobody does it anymore. Number 25, the newspaper suit. It sounds almost like a joke when you first hear it, but this was one of the most widespread survival practices among homeless men during the Great Depression, and the science behind it is completely solid. Men who were sleeping outside in cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit would stuff layers of newspaper inside their clothing, under their shirts, lining their jackets, wrapping it around their legs under their trousers. Newspaper is an extraordinary insulator. It traps air, it blocks wind, and it creates a thermal barrier between your skin and the cold air outside. Studies done decades later confirmed that a single layer of newspaper can reduce heat loss by nearly 40% in dry conditions. Men who mastered this technique folded the sheets in specific ways, never crumpled, always flat and layered, to maximize coverage and minimize rustling noise, because rustling meant cops could hear you moving in the night and would run you off your sleeping spot. They replaced the paper every 2 to 3 days when it became too damp from body sweat to insulate effectively. Some men became experts at sourcing the thickest print editions. Sunday papers were prized because the ink density added an extra marginal layer of insulation. It was free, it was everywhere, and it kept men alive through winters that killed dozens of their peers. Number 24, reading the hobo code. This is the one that surprises people the most when they first learn about it. During the Great Depression, there was an entire secret written language scratched into fence posts, sidewalks, telephone poles, and the sides of buildings across the United States, a system of symbols used exclusively by homeless men and hobos to communicate critical survival information to each other. A circle with 2 arrows meant, "This is a good place to camp." A cross meant, "Religious people live here. You can ask for food." A wavy line meant, "Bad water nearby." A cat symbol meant, "A kind woman lives here." A top hat symbol meant, "A wealthy man lives here, but he will not help you." These symbols were updated constantly, scratched over, modified, and expanded as conditions changed. Men who knew the code could walk into a completely unfamiliar town and within an hour understand which streets were dangerous, which houses would feed you, which local cops were violent, and where the nearest safe water source was. It was a living, breathing, crowdsourced survival map, decades before anyone had a word for crowdsourcing. City governments in several states tried to make the creation of these symbols illegal, which only pushed the code underground and made it more elaborate. Number 23, the jungle kitchen. When groups of homeless men camped together in areas known as hobo jungles, makeshift communities typically found at the edges of railroad yards, they developed a remarkably organized communal cooking system. Every man who arrived at a jungle was expected to contribute something to the communal pot, even if it was just a handful of salt, a few wild onions pulled from the ground, or a single potato. The rule was absolute and universally enforced. You eat from the pot, you add to the pot. No exceptions. This created a kind of survival economy that meant nobody in the jungle went entirely without food as long as the community held together. The cooking itself was done in large tin cans, or improvised iron pots over fires built to minimize smoke. Too much smoke attracted attention from railroad police, known as bulls, who would violently disperse the camps. The men became expert foragers, knowing which weeds were edible, which berries were safe, and which roots could be boiled down for nutrition. Mullein leaves, lamb's quarters, dandelion roots, and cattail pollen were all common additions to the jungle pot. Some jungles had designated cooks, who had developed genuine culinary skills over years on the road, and they were treated with enormous respect. Number 22. Cardboard architecture. The homeless men of the Great Depression understood something that modern architects have confirmed in insulation studies. Cardboard is a genuinely effective building material when used correctly. Men who were building temporary shelters, in alleyways, under bridges, in vacant lots, developed specific techniques for layering and sealing cardboard to create structures that could hold off rain and wind for days or even weeks. The key was never using a single layer. You always doubled or tripled the cardboard, offsetting the seams so no two gaps lined up, exactly the way professional roofers offset shingles. The outer layers were coated with whatever waxy or oily substance could be found: lard, axle grease, even candle wax rubbed directly into the surface, to create a water-resistant barrier. The inner layers were kept dry at all costs, because dry cardboard insulates and wet cardboard is worse than nothing. Men who built these structures properly were known among their peers as having good hands, and their shelters were sometimes occupied by multiple people, creating a de facto community housing system in spaces that city officials would not have believed possible. Number 21. The art of the ask. Surviving on the road during the Depression required not just physical ingenuity, but a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Men who were successful at securing food, work, or shelter from strangers had developed a precise and field-tested approach to asking. First, you never asked at the front door, always the back door, near the kitchen, because the person who answered the back door was almost always a woman working in the kitchen, and statistically, women responded more generously to direct requests for food than men did. Second, you always offered to work. You did not ask for charity. You asked for a meal in exchange for chopping wood, fixing a fence, carrying water, cleaning gutters. The work offer transformed the interaction from a handout into a transaction, which most Americans in that era found far more acceptable. Third, and this is the part that seems almost calculated, you always asked for less than you actually needed. If you needed a full meal, you asked for just a piece of bread. The instinct of any generous person is to give more than what was asked for, and experienced men knew this and exploited it consistently. It worked, repeatedly. Number 20. Making shoes last. For a man living on the road, shoes were arguably the most critical piece of equipment he owned, and losing them to wear or weather could be genuinely life-threatening. Homeless men during the Depression developed a series of techniques for extending shoe life far beyond what the manufacturers had intended. Stuffing the insoles with layers of cut-up burlap sack created additional cushioning and absorbed moisture before it could rot the leather. Men would soak leather shoes in warm animal fat, whatever was available, to keep the leather supple and waterproof, preventing the cracking that destroyed most shoes within months of hard road walking. Cardboard cut to the exact shape of the insole could replace worn soles for short periods and was replaced daily. When the outer sole wore through completely, men would cut rubber from discarded tire inner tubes and nail or wire it to the remaining shoe structure. A technique so effective that several shoe repair businesses adopted versions of it professionally after the Depression ended. The men who took care of their shoes took care of their feet, and the men who took care of their feet survived significantly longer on the road. Number 19. Rain as a resource. While most people think of rain as a problem for someone living outdoors, the most experienced homeless men of the Depression era had learned to treat rain as one of their most valuable resources. Rainwater is chemically clean, requires no purification in most rural settings, and falls for free. Men developed specific collection systems, angling tarps and pieces of oilcloth into funnel shapes that directed water into any available container. Tin cans, glass jars, folded pieces of oilskin. A single moderate rainstorm could fill enough containers to supply a small group with drinking water for 2 to 3 days. Men also used rain for bathing, which was not a luxury, but a genuine health necessity. Skin infections, lice, and fungal conditions were major causes of disability and death among the homeless population. Experienced men would strip down and wash completely during summer rainstorms, using a sliver of soap carefully wrapped in cloth and carried in a pocket. The act of staying clean was not vanity. It was survival strategy, because sick men couldn't work, and men who couldn't work couldn't eat. Number 18. Riding the rails. This one needs to be said clearly. Riding freight trains was illegal, dangerous, and directly responsible for thousands of deaths during the Depression era. And yet it was also one of the primary modes of transportation for the estimated 250 Iwo homeless teenagers and 2 million homeless adults who were moving constantly across the country in search of work. The technique had rules that experienced riders passed down with the seriousness of law. You never jumped a moving train. You always waited for it to slow at a yard or a curve. You rode in boxcars when possible. Never on top of cars in wet weather, and absolutely never between cars, where the coupling mechanisms could crush a man in seconds if he slipped. You always kept your hands free. Nothing in your hands when you jumped, because instinctively reaching to protect whatever you were carrying had killed dozens of men who let go of the ladder at the wrong moment. And you always knew your destination before you got on, because riding past your intended stop into unfamiliar territory with hostile railroad bulls could end your journey permanently. If this kind of raw history is landing hard for you, drop a comment below telling me which trick surprised you most. I read every single one. Number 17. The Mulligan Stew Formula. Named after the old Irish-American word for a mess or a mixture, Mulligan stew was the iconic food of the Great Depression hobo, and the best practitioners of it had elevated it to a genuine skill. The base rule was simple. Everything edible goes in. But the skill was in knowing what could and couldn't be made edible through long boiling, how to balance flavors when you had no salt, and how to use wild plants to add nutrition when the main ingredients were thin. Men who were expert at Mulligan stew knew that boiling bones, any bones, from any animal, for 3 or more hours extracted collagen, fat, and minerals that turned thin water into something genuinely nourishing. They knew that certain wild plants, lamb's quarters, purslane, wood sorrel, added vitamins that prevented the deficiency diseases that were killing men who ate nothing but white bread and black coffee. The best stew makers in a jungle camp were community assets, protected and fed by the group in exchange for their skills, in an arrangement that mirrors the role of skilled craftsmen in every pre-industrial community in human history. Number 16. The warmth of work. One of the most counterintuitive survival tricks that experienced homeless men used during the Depression was the deliberate seeking of physically demanding labor, specifically as a means of thermal regulation, not income. On dangerously cold nights, men who knew they couldn't find shelter would seek out any work that kept them moving, unloading trucks, shoveling snow, carrying crates in a warehouse loading dock. Because the body heat generated by sustained physical labor is substantial and can prevent hypothermia in conditions that would kill a stationary man. The pay was secondary. The warmth was primary. Some men became expert at identifying which businesses received early morning deliveries that required manual unloading, positioning themselves at loading docks before dawn to offer their services for pennies or for food, knowing that 2 or 3 hours of hard physical work in the early morning cold was the difference between waking up alive and not waking up at all. This is one of the tricks that modern wilderness survival instructors now teach explicitly, often without knowing that Depression-era homeless men had systematized it nearly a century ago. Number 15. The half-meal strategy. Men who had spent more than a few months on the road discovered something that nutritionists would confirm decades later. Eating smaller amounts more frequently is dramatically more effective for sustained energy and cognitive function than eating one large meal and going hungry for the rest of the day. Experienced homeless men, when they did manage to secure food, would consciously eat only half of what they had, saving the remainder for later, even when hunger made this feel like torture. The reasoning was practical. A man who ate everything at once would be functional for 3 or 4 hours and then crash. A man who spread the same amount of food across a day could maintain basic cognitive function, the ability to problem solve, to read people, to make good decisions, for much longer. And in a survival situation, cognitive function is more valuable than physical fullness. The men who practiced this consistently were described by their peers as seeming always calm because they were never in the desperate tunnel vision state that severe acute hunger produces. Number 14. Navigation by environment. Men who spent years riding freight trains and walking long distances developed an extraordinary ability to navigate without maps using environmental cues that most modern people have completely lost. Moss grows thickest on the north-facing side of trees in the northern hemisphere. Ant hills are almost always built on the south side of trees and rocks, where warmth is greatest. The stars, particularly Polaris, which sits directly above the North Pole, gave reliable directional information on clear nights. Rivers almost always flow south or southeast in the eastern United States due to the general lay of the land. The direction of prevailing winds, which in the continental U.S. generally blow from west to east, could help a man orient himself on a cloudy day. Men who knew these cues could walk out of an unfamiliar forest and identify the nearest town with a reliability that seems almost impossible to someone who has grown up with GPS. This knowledge was passed on explicitly, man to man, in camp conversations that were simultaneously community bonding and survival education. Number 13. The layered fire. Building a fire as a homeless man in the Depression era was a skill with layers of complexity that most people don't consider. The fire had to be warm enough to be useful, but small enough not to attract attention. It had to burn long enough to serve its purpose but be completely extinguishable within seconds if someone approached. And it had to be built from materials that produced minimal smoke, because smoke was visible for miles during the day and could lead authorities directly to your location. Men developed specific fire architectures for specific situations. The Dakota hole, a technique almost certainly learned from indigenous knowledge, involved digging 2 connected holes in the ground, one for the fire and one for air intake, which created a self-feeding draft that produced intense heat with almost no visible smoke or flame above ground level. Button fires, tiny, carefully maintained fires built in tin cans with small holes punched for airflow, could heat a small shelter and cook a can of food with almost no outward sign. If you haven't subscribed yet and this kind of detail is the stuff you think about late at night, do it right now. There's so much more where this came from. Number 12. The art of invisibility. Being invisible, in a social, not a physical sense, was one of the most critical survival skills for a homeless man in Depression-era America. Being seen, being noticed, being identified as homeless triggered a cascade of responses from the surrounding society that were almost universally bad. Arrest, assault, forced labor in work camps, or simply being driven out of a town that you'd been counting on for food or shelter. Men who were successful at long-term survival learned to present themselves in ways that blurred their status. They washed their faces and hands at any available opportunity. They kept their clothing as clean and unrumpled as possible. They made eye contact with people and nodded in greeting, rather than looking at the ground, which was the behavioral signature of a man who expected to be chased. They walked purposefully, as if they had somewhere specific to be, not the slow shuffle of a man with nowhere to go. Several men who wrote memoirs of their Depression-era experiences noted that the ability to pass, to look functional and purposeful in public, was the difference between eating and going hungry on dozens of specific occasions. Number 11. Water purification without tools. Clean water was not a given for a man living on the road in the 1930s, and contaminated water was responsible for a significant percentage of illness and death among the homeless population. Men who had been on the road long enough had developed a hierarchy of water source reliability and a set of field techniques for improving the safety of questionable water. Running water was always preferred over standing water. Water from upstream of any town was significantly safer than water from downstream, where human and animal waste contaminated the supply. Boiling, even for just a few minutes, killed the pathogens responsible for typhoid and cholera, and every man who carried a tin can was carrying a potential boiling vessel. When boiling wasn't possible, leaving water to sit in sunlight in a clear glass jar for several hours, now known as solar disinfection or SODIS, was practiced by men who had no scientific explanation for why it worked, but had observed empirically that it reduced illness. The acidity of certain plant materials, wood sorrel, which contains oxalic acid, was used to treat water in emergencies, with mixed, but not negligible effectiveness. Number 10. The Trust Network. Survival over extended periods was almost impossible alone. Men who lasted more than a year on the road without permanent housing had almost invariably built and maintained a network of trusted relationships that provided them with information, resources, and occasional physical protection. These networks operated on strict codes of reciprocity and were maintained across thousands of miles through the jungle telegraph, the oral information network that connected hobo communities across the continent. A man who arrived at a jungle in Kansas might carry a message or a small package to someone in a jungle in Kansas City, arriving as a known and trusted visitor rather than a stranger. Men helped each other find work, warned each other about dangerous areas, covered for each other in interactions with authorities, and shared food during hard stretches with the understanding that the favor would be returned when circumstances changed. This network was not charity. It was infrastructure. And it was robust enough that federal authorities investigating communist organizing in the early 1930s repeatedly mistook hobo social networks for political organizing cells because the level of coordination was so sophisticated. Number 9. Reading weather. The ability to accurately read incoming weather was not a minor convenience for a man sleeping outside. It was a matter of life and death. Experienced roadmen developed a sophisticated ability to interpret atmospheric conditions that, while less precise than modern meteorology, was reliable enough to give meaningful advance warning of dangerous weather changes. Red sky at morning is a genuine meteorological indicator, not just folklore. It signals moisture and dust in the air to the east, meaning weather is moving in from the west. Rapidly falling barometric pressure, which can be felt as a subtle but detectable change in ear pressure by people who are sufficiently attuned to it, precedes severe storms by 4 to 6 hours. The behavior of animals, particularly birds flying low and cattle gathering in tight groups, was noted and used. The smell of rain, petrichor, the compound released when moisture hits dry earth, can be detected up to a mile before rain actually arrives under the right wind conditions. Men who were good at weather reading could reliably find shelter 30 to 60 minutes ahead of a dangerous storm, while men who ignored the signs were found drowned in flooded culverts or dead from exposure after being caught in blizzards. Number 8. The sock trick. This one is absurdly simple, and it's one of the reasons this list exists. Homeless men who had learned it from experience knew that the single most effective thing you could do to stay warm on a cold night, if you had access to any extra material at all, was to double your socks. Not because 2 layers of sock material provides dramatically more insulation than one, though it does, but because the air trapped between the 2 layers is the actual insulator. This is the principle behind every modern thermal garment ever made. The men had no access to the science. They had only the observation, passed from man to man, that if you put a thin pair of socks over your regular socks before sleep, you woke up with your feet intact instead of numb. They extended this principle to every part of the body. 2 thin layers of any material always outperformed 1 thick layer of the same material. Men who understood this principle survived winters that killed men who had heavier but single-layer clothing. It is now the foundational principle of cold weather layering and is taught in every wilderness survival course offered anywhere in the developed world. These men figured it out from necessity, decades before outdoor clothing brands made it a marketing slogan. Number 7. Using the library. This is one of the most profoundly underappreciated survival tools that homeless men had access to during the Depression, and the ones who took advantage of it gained capabilities that gave them enormous advantages over their peers. Public libraries were free, warm, dry, and open to anyone who was quiet and presentable. Men who used them consistently did 4 things that were survival critical. First, they read job listings in newspapers that were kept on file, critical when the newspaper itself cost money they didn't have. Second, they read maps and learned the geography of unfamiliar regions before passing through them. Third, they studied practical skills from books: carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, farming, animal husbandry, and used that knowledge to present themselves as having specific skills when seeking work. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly in the long run, they stayed mentally sharp. The psychological deterioration caused by extended periods of idleness, helplessness, and social isolation was one of the primary reasons men gave up on survival entirely. Men who read, who learned, who maintained some intellectual engagement with the world did not deteriorate at the same rate. The library was not a luxury. For some men, it was the thing that kept them human enough to keep going. Drop a comment below. Do you think that's still true today? I want to know what you think. Number 6. Animal fat as a multi-tool. Rendered animal fat, lard, tallow, or any fat that could be collected from food scraps, discarded bones, or the occasional small animal, was one of the most versatile survival materials available to a man on the road during the Depression, and men who knew how to use it had a significant advantage over those who didn't. As a skin protectant, a thin layer of animal fat applied to exposed skin before sleeping outside in cold weather could reduce heat loss and prevent the frostbite-related skin damage that put men out of commission for weeks. As a leather preservative, it extended the life of shoes and belts dramatically, as described earlier. As a cooking fat, it transformed nutritionally thin meals into calorie-dense ones. As a lubricant for mechanical work, which men frequently performed in exchange for food, it could substitute for machine oil in a pinch. As a base for improvised candles, it was melted and used with a twisted rag wick to provide light and marginal heat in enclosed shelters. Men who collected and stored animal fat in any available tin or jar were known to trade it with peers, and in some jungle communities, fat had more practical value per ounce than almost any other material available. Number 5. The split identity. Some of the most experienced men on the road during the Depression maintained what could only be described as a split identity, a version of themselves for official interactions and a different version for their actual life on the road. When dealing with authorities, relief agencies, potential employers, or any institution that had the power to help or harm them, they adopted names, histories, and behavioral presentations that were carefully constructed to maximize the likelihood of a positive response. This was not simply lying. It was sophisticated identity management. A man with a foreign-sounding name might adopt an anglicized version when applying for work in towns where ethnic prejudice was severe. A man who had a criminal record, even for minor offenses, would present a clean history. Men who had learned to read and write well would help others craft these narratives in exchange for food or protection. The ethical complexity of this practice was not lost on the men themselves. Many who wrote about their Depression experiences discussed it with evident discomfort. But the practical reality was that the social environment they were navigating had almost no tolerance for truthful complexity, and the men who adapted to that reality were the ones who survived it. Number 4. Knowing when to move. Counterintuitive as it sounds, one of the most critical survival decisions a homeless man could make during the Depression was the decision to leave a place where he had found some stability. Men who stayed too long in any one location became known to local authorities, known to the community, and targeted for removal or arrest. The general consensus among experienced travelers was that 3 to 5 days was the maximum safe stay in any location where you didn't have a genuine social connection protecting you. The timing of departure was also critical. Leaving before being asked to leave meant leaving on your own terms, with your supplies intact and your route chosen. Being forced to leave meant leaving under duress, often after an assault by local police or railroad bulls, sometimes without your belongings, and always with your physical and psychological resources depleted. The men who had internalized this principle moved with a rhythm that looked to outsiders like restlessness or instability. To themselves, it was discipline. It was the maintenance of mobility, which was the maintenance of freedom, which was the closest thing to safety available in their circumstances. Number 3. Trading knowledge for food. In the survival economy of the Depression road, knowledge was one of the most consistently valuable currencies available to a man with nothing else to offer. Men who had specific, demonstrable knowledge, about farming, animal care, mechanical repair, construction, medicine, or even just literacy, could trade that knowledge directly for food, shelter, and protection. A man who knew how to set a broken bone, diagnose a sick animal, sharpen a plow blade, or write a letter for an illiterate farmer occupied a position of genuine value that could not be easily replaced. Men who recognized this explicitly, and many did, invested deliberate effort in acquiring and maintaining a repertoire of practical skills, specifically because those skills were convertible into survival resources. This created a culture of learning within hobo communities that is deeply counterintuitive to anyone whose mental image of homelessness is one of passivity or helplessness. The men who lasted were not passive. They were, in many cases, among the most industriously self-improving people in the country, because for them, self-improvement was not a lifestyle aspiration. It was a survival strategy. Number 2. The cold weather shelter formula. Building a shelter that could reliably keep a man alive through a hard winter night, with no tools, no manufactured materials, and no permanent structure, was a skill refined over years of brutal field testing by thousands of men across the northern United States. The formula that emerged from that testing had specific elements that experienced men treated as inviolable. Small is warm. A shelter that fits exactly one man retains body heat at rates that a larger space cannot match. Insulation from the ground is more important than insulation from the air. The earth draws heat from a body at a rate 3 to 4 times faster than still air, so a thick layer of dry leaves, grass, cardboard, or pine needles between a man and the ground is the single most important element of any cold weather sleep setup. Wind is more dangerous than cold. A shelter that blocks wind but provides less insulation will outperform a warmer shelter with gaps in windy conditions. And the entrance should always face away from the prevailing wind direction, which in the continental United States means facing east or southeast. Men who applied these principles consistently survived winters in the upper Midwest and the mountain states in structures that, to a modern observer, would look completely inadequate for the task. They were not inadequate. They were precisely calibrated. And now we come to it. Number 1. The trick that Earl Wheeler, the man from Cincinnati who walked out of that bank in 1932, later said had saved his life more times than he could count. The trick that he taught to every man who camped near him, and that those men taught forward, until it had spread through hobo communities from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, and from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. The trick that is simultaneously the most practical and the most profound piece of survival wisdom to come out of the entire Great Depression experience. Number 1. Community as infrastructure. Earl Wheeler and men like him across the country had discovered, or perhaps rediscovered, since no human culture in history has survived for long in isolation, that the single most powerful survival tool available to any person in any crisis is the deliberate, sustained, and unconditional investment in the well-being of the people around you. Not because it feels good, not because it is morally correct, though it may be, but because in a survival context, every person who survives because of your help is a person who is now available to help you. Every skill you teach is a skill that now exists in your vicinity and can be used on your behalf. Every piece of food you share is a transaction in the most important economy available to a person with no money, the economy of reciprocal obligation. Men who operated on purely individualistic logic, who hoarded information, hoarded food, refused to teach or share or cover for others, were consistently less likely to survive the winter than men who operated as nodes in a community network, even when the individualists started with more resources. The math of mutual aid, as the men of the road called it, simply outperformed the math of individual accumulation in every scenario that stretched longer than a few weeks. Earl Wheeler lived to be 83 years old. He spent 40 years after the Depression working as a labor organizer and community educator. And he gave the same answer every single time anyone asked him what had gotten him through. Community. Not a trick. Not a technique. Not a tool. The people around you, treat it as if their survival matters as much as your own. Because in the end it does. And in the end, knowing that is the most sophisticated survival skill there has ever been. What you have just heard is not just history, It is a manual. These 25 tricks were not invented in a lab or a university. They were stress-tested in the hardest conditions the 20th century produced by men who had nothing to fall back on and no margin for error. Every single one of them worked. Every single one of them is still relevant. And the question I want you to sit with, the one I want you to drop in the comments below, is this. Which one of these would you have figured out on your own? Be honest with yourself, because the answer to that question will tell you something important about how prepared you actually are for the world to change on you the way it changed on Earl Wheeler in 1932. He had no warning. Neither will you. Subscribe if you want to be the kind of person who is ready when it comes.